What's up, everybody? Thank you for checking this out. Please, if you're in the live chat, let me know how the audio is. Hopefully, it's coming through clear, and I will try to monitor the live chat to make sure that I can read any comments, and then we'll take some time to answer a few questions toward the end. But feel free to put your questions in the live chat, and if I see it and it corresponds with what we're talking about, I will definitely read it out if I can. Dr. Garte, thank you so much for being with us today.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
No problem. So I'm actually, this is I think a first for me. I think that you're the only guest that I've had who I haven't read your book yet. And the reason for that, for the audience, is not because I didn't want to read it, right? It's because Sai and myself, we were already planning on doing a project, working together on a project today, and we set it up. And he said, hey, I've got some extra time if you need. I said, well, why don't you just come on and let me interview you? Because I've seen you before on some channels, and I found your story very interesting. But I was unable in a few days to get the book and read it. I tried. I was looking on Audible because I was like, man, if it's on Audible, I can just listen to it over the next 2 days. But that's something maybe to consider in the future. But yeah, definitely, I'm going to check it out, and maybe I'd like to have you back after reading the book as well to kind of go into it more.
Okay.
Okay. But with that being said, let's go into your background a little bit before your actual academic background, because I think that's important. Because we typically hear, one of the arguments we typically hear from non-believers is going to be, yeah, well, you grew up Christian, right? And you had the North American background. So, you know, it makes sense that you're a Christian, kind of like we don't make our own decisions. We're just, you know, we're just victims of where we're standing. But your background wasn't like that, was it? Why don't you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, I did not grow up Christian. That's accurate. I grew up sort of the opposite of Christian, and that is that my parents were anti-theists. They were actually very far left-wing. They were members of the American Communist Party in the 30s, which had as part of its dogma a very strong anti-theistic component, and especially anti-Christian. The communists believed very strongly that Christianity was one of their main enemies, one of the main competitors they had for the minds and beliefs of the people they were trying to target. So I grew up in an environment that hated religion, I wasn't just an atheist. I was a hater of religion, a hater of Christianity. I remember Easter, I thought was a horrendous holiday. I never celebrated, obviously never celebrated Christmas or anything else. And so that's where I started from. And that went along with a very materialistic worldview. I believe that there was no such thing as anything supernatural or spiritual or anything other than, the naturalistic, materialistic worldview, which is common to many atheists.
Very interesting. Yeah, so that's kind of quite a different path from where you ended up, because now obviously you're a Christian.
Yeah.
And so so I've got a lot of questions, obviously, but like one would be like, do you just consider yourself a Protestant, or do you have a specific denomination that you follow?
Well, that's an interesting question too. When I started thinking about God, I knew nothing about denominations. I knew there was a difference between Catholics and Protestants, but I grew up in New York City and in Brooklyn, and I never met a Protestant in my life until I was in college. I think I finally met one. You were either Catholic or Jewish or Black or Puerto Rican. I mean, those were the categories. Irish and Italians were Catholics, and I never knew any Protestants. So I eventually began, and this is documented in my book. It's what the book is all about. I eventually began asking questions about my worldview. which did not match with the science that I was learning. It was science that started chipping holes away in my materialistic worldview. And eventually I started thinking about other things. I was a youth in the 60s. I'm a boomer. And so at that time, there was a lot of interest in spirituality, not religion, but spirituality. People were looking in transcendental meditation, and, Buddhism was very big and all that stuff. And I didn't get into any of that, but at least it was sort of making me think a little bit. And I started thinking about the whole idea of something beyond just the material. And very, very slowly, I began to think about the possibility of God. And then I met some people. I met a woman who was a Christian. She was Catholic, and she brought me to a church, first time in my life. And this was in my 40s. And I was very surprised what happened in the church, because I was terrified to go in. I'd never been in a church, and I thought I would be stoned or, whatever, at least yelled at and pointed to as a horrible sinner. But all I found was love, and I was very surprised. The priest was preaching about love. People were very friendly, welcoming, and open. Not what I expected at all. Not what I'd heard as a child. About the evils of the Christian world. So eventually, again, now a long story, and I'm not going to go into it. It's in the book. I had several experiences, including some dreams. I was being called by the Holy Spirit incessantly. I mean, God was not being patient with me. He just kept going. He just kept knocking on my door, and I kept saying, "I don't hear anything. There's nothing there. Forget about it. It's just my imagination. It's whatever." Anyway, eventually he broke through. God, the Holy Spirit broke through, and I began to realize that there is something, and I began to call myself a Christian. But to answer your question, I had no idea what to do with that. The only religion I knew was Catholicism, and I didn't know much about it. And I'm not going to get into this, but I thought about becoming a Catholic, but that didn't work out. And so I decided to go to a Protestant church, and I had no idea about Protestant churches. And by chance, I walked into a Methodist church, and I heard the sermon, and I just loved it. And I went back the next week, and the pastor came over to me and asked me, who I was and why I was there. And I said, well, I've been thinking about getting baptized. And I was baptized a week later. And at that time, I was in my early 60s. So that's how and then once that happened, I became very active in that church, and I eventually became the lay leader and remained very active in the church. And now that I'm retired, I spend a lot of time in that church. But I've been to many churches. I've been to Baptist churches and Presbyterian of many denominations, and not knowing much about theology and not really caring that much about theology, to be honest, I think I would be perfectly comfortable in any denomination. If they worship Jesus Christ, I'm fine.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So that actually answered my question. I really appreciate that, because I would say that I'm very similar to that. Now, you mentioned that your science background, and that's kind of what I want to get into next. Is tell us a little bit about your academic career and some of the things that you've already started to talk about. I know I'm going to understand a lot better once I finally read the book, of course. Which I'm going to definitely do.
The first few chapters are about science. That's right.
Yeah. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your academic background, and then kind of your journey through academics. Like, first of all, what gets you interested in? You're a biochemist, and first of all, what gets you interested in science, and then second of all, where did you go from start to I'm interested in this to what was your journey like?
Yeah. Well, I mentioned that my parents were materialists. My father was actually a chemist. He was a scientist himself, and he worked in chemistry. And I think my interest in science was a legacy from him. I love chemistry, and in fact, I was a chemistry major in college. But I also, I've always been interested in life. I mean, what is, and I, to this day, you know, I ask the same questions. What is life? Where did it come from? How does it work? And biochemistry seemed to me to be the best way to approach that. So I decided to, after I got my college degree, I decided to go to graduate school in biochemistry, and I did. Got a PhD, and then began an academic career as a postdoc, and eventually I got on faculty. This is at New York University, and I began doing research and began publishing papers, and I had a long career in that area. I was eventually at 3 different universities, published over 200 scientific papers, I guess something like 210 or 15, I lost count. And I've just, in fact, I haven't stopped publishing. I published a paper last year related to the origin of life. I'm talking about mainstream science journals. I've also published articles in Christian forums, but I continue to work in mainstream science. And in fact, I'm working right now on another paper, actually 2 more papers on origin of life, which is my main interest. And these are theoretical papers. They're not, I don't have a lab, so I don't do any lab work anymore. But I will never give up my interest in science. I think that one of the quotes from my book, I'll give you a spoiler here, is something that I is kind of consider my motto. And that is, I say that science is distilled doxology. Because I believe that when you do science, it's the purest form of worship. You're worshiping the work of the creator.
Kind of like, who was it, Galileo or Kepler that said, "I'm thinking God's thoughts after him"?
Yeah, I think it was. Well, now I don't remember which, but it was one of those 2. Right?
So yeah, it's kind of that same idea, right?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah. So I love that. And you know what's interesting is you talked about your when God was kind of knocking on the door, right? And you were like, "I'm not answering," kind of thing.
Right.
A lot of people are going to say, a lot of non-believers are going to say, well, maybe that's just some feeling he had or something, but you didn't have the background to have some type of religious type feeling. You were kind of actually resistant to it. And one thing I found interesting is I listened to an interview that you've done before, maybe this has been a while back, and I remember you using the phrase, it wasn't after I started believing that I, started getting this. It's before I even started.
Oh yeah.
I had this knocking, and then I realized it. You see,
Yeah.
one of the things that I like to delineate in differences is a lot of non-believers think of the Holy Spirit or like this, God knocking on your heart or whatever. Like they like to think of this as some type of just feeling you have, maybe based on something you ate or whatever. But I like to talk about it in the example of like realization. So I thought that the fact that you said that, I was like, that's perfect, because that's exactly my point of view. And the example I like to give is when you're asleep, right? And you wake up and you got to be somewhere at 8 o'clock, and you turn and look and you see that it says 7:59, and then you just turn and go and lay back down. You know what it says, but when you realize it, wait, you realize the gravity of the situation. Now all of a sudden you go from 0 energy to hopping from room to room on 1 foot while pulling up your pants and brushing your teeth at the same time.
Right.
It instantly.
That's a good analogy. I like that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so whenever I heard you say like, no, this was knocking on me, or this was something that was on my kind of a weight on me before I even became religious, but I didn't realize it yet. You want to talk about maybe that a little bit, like how would
there are 2 or 3 dreams that I describe in the book, but I could talk about the first one, which happened long before I thought about God or becoming a theist, and I had no idea what it meant. And what it was that I was hanging off a cliff, and I have fear of heights, and that was a terrifying dream for me because here I am way up high and I'm holding on for dear life onto a cliff. I don't know what to do. There's no way I can pull myself up. And I'm just terrified. And then I hear a voice that says, just let go. And I thought, well, that's crazy. How could I let go? I'll fall down. And it said again, just let go. So I did. And before I could start to fall, the world turned 90 degrees so that instead of being vertical, I was lying on the ground. And instead of clutching with my fingernails onto a cliff, I was lying on the ground holding onto a rock. And I was fine. And I got up, and I had no idea what that meant. No idea. Mm. It was only later that I realized, because I had another dream later where I had already been starting to think about God and especially about Jesus. And I think I'd already read one of the Gospels by that time and was very intrigued, but not convinced. And I had this other dream, and then I remembered where there was also a figure who spoke to me, and it was the same voice. And then I thought back to that dream that I'd had a decade earlier, and I realized that was Jesus Christ telling me to let go. And what was I supposed to let go of? All the things that were preventing me from believing, from hearing the word of God. All the lies I had heard in my youth, all the philosophical justifications for materialism and for atheism. That was what was blocking me. It was holding me back. And when I let go of that, I was fine. And so I have said that to people online, to atheists online, who have said to me, why doesn't God call me? Why don't I hear it? I ask and I want to hear, and nothing happens. And what I tell them is let go, just let go.
That's very interesting. You know, I definitely can resonate with that. I feel like your story is definitely an outlier as far as like your background and how. Also, you know, I think I remember Clay Jones. I'm not sure if you know Professor Clay Jones, but I think I remember him having a very similar background as you. His dad was in.
I don't know the name.
Okay. I think he's a professor of theology, I believe it is.
Oh.
But he had a very similar background, if I'm remembering correctly, it was him as you, and he ended up where you are. But so let me ask you this. I got one question I'm really interested in is, it seems to me that as a scientist, you're going to get pushback for coming out as a Christian, right? Not from the scientific community necessarily, but more from the people who are going to say, oh, well, now he's going to try and justify that he's a Christian and a scientist, right? What types of feedback or like pushback do you get from non-believers first? And then I want to talk about the type of pushback you're going to get from believers now, right? So let's talk about first, in the scientific field, do you get looked at differently? Do people read your papers differently? Do they ever try and like judge your work and say like, well, he's trying to let God in the door or something like that?
No, that does not happen if you're writing and publishing and working in strictly scientific areas, because the truth is that science and religious faith, although they're not incompatible, they use completely different methods and completely different languages and completely different goals. So I would never consider the idea of trying to prove that God exists scientifically. That's just not there. So for example, the papers that I wrote, I'm writing on origin of life. One of them I'm working on with two atheists, by the way. So, you know, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, sure.
But the others are strictly scientific. Now they do have results, and this you can also find in other people who write papers that might, you know, promote intelligent design or something, where there may be. But if they're really in the scientific genre, they're not going to go into anything that's of spiritual or transcendent significance. So I have not gotten any negative pushback about any of my scientific work from scientists. On the other hand, I'm on Twitter. I'm pretty active on Twitter. I have a reasonable following. And I have a lot of atheists who come on, and I finally came up with a policy that I will block anyone who directly insults me. If they call me a fraud or something like that, I block them. And I've blocked over 200 people so far. So I get a lot of bad insults. People say, "Oh, you never were a scientist." It's all bullshit.
Right.
So but those are not scientists. Those are atheists. Many of them, I think, are probably angry, and they're not really thinking very clearly. So there is some pushback in that regard. And I think I know there are 2 or 3 who I'm still in contact with who are just very angry at me for what they call giving a scientific excuse for theism or something.
Well,
on the other hand, just let me finish this one thing.
Yeah,
on the other hand,
that.
no, that's all right. On the other hand, I have very good relations with a number of atheists, some of them well known, like Aaron Ra, Paul Oja. I mean, there's quite a few who I've talked with, Tom Jump, Pine Creek. These are all well known YouTube atheists. I've interviewed with all of them, and I don't think we hate each other. I think we disagree, but I think we all respect each other. It's a question of personal, how people are. I mean, there are Christians who I've had much worse disagreements with, which I guess is your next question. So
before that though, I wanted to say that it's interesting the way you put that some atheists are like, hey, you're given this viability to Christians because of what you're saying. And it's funny to me because I believe it was Richard Dawkins who said something very similar. Like he said, Darwin made it so that so that atheists could be intellectually fulfilled. We lost Sai. Let me see. Maybe he'll pop right back in here. What's up to everybody in the chat? Thanks for being here. Eric Verenthaler, I will get to your question. Sorry, I always have a problem. Your last name's always a little bit difficult. Brian Stevens, thanks for being here. JG, thanks for the like. Appreciate that. Everybody who's watching, please hit the like button if you haven't already. And if you're new to the channel, please subscribe. All right, looks like we got Sai back.
I'm sorry about that. I did something wrong.
Yeah, sometimes mine does that.
It was me. I clicked the wrong thing. Sorry about that.
So what I was saying is that it sounded very much like how Richard Dawkins says that Darwin made it so that atheists can be intellectually fulfilled.
Exactly, right.
And so it seemed like one of them, Darwin, is using it as a, not as a pejorative. And then the other side is telling you that, hey, you're doing this for theists, like don't do that, or and I'm sure they probably have more nuanced arguments. But now I do want to kind of transition though, because I got a feeling that you having a background in biology, biochemistry, like I feel like you probably get a lot of people who don't share the scientific approach that you do. Say young earth creationists or someone like this, saying, listen, this guy, he just was an atheist and he believed all this stuff about science that they believe, and then he brought it to our beliefs, and I just feel like you probably get that a lot. Do you typically get that? And then how do you typically respond?
Actually, I get a little bit. I mean, I've had some debates with Kent Hovind and a couple of other young earth creationists, but I have a lot of creationist followers, and my view about young Earth versus old Earth, or evolution versus not evolution, is that these are really trivial issues, and I don't agree that they are salvation issues, or that they are important enough to divide people. If you, as I do, and nobody has ever doubted this, if you believe that Jesus Christ is our Lord and Savior, and that he died for our sins and rose on the third day, and he is with us every step of the way, the rest of the rest is details. And I don't know whether evolution is true, or, I mean, if it turned it, when I find out, once I'm in the new world, in the new life, everlasting, if God tells me that you were wrong, the Bible is literally true, and everything happened in 6 days, 6,000 years ago, I'll say, thank you, Lord. I didn't know. Thank you for correcting me. I would not be surprised. I don't know what's the truth. I don't know if nobody knows what's the truth, because science is a tool to find the truth, and it's not perfect. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, great point. I was talking to, I spoke to Hugh Ross earlier today on my friend Rob's show.
Yeah,
and
Hugh is a great guy. Yeah.
Yes, and he takes, a different approach than a lot of other people I've listened to. Like John Walton, right? And he talked about this morning how, I like John Walton a lot, and I actually like his view as well. But he goes and just says, hey, look, Genesis it matches the temple, the temple dedication, literature of that time. This isn't trying to communicate science.
Right. That's exactly right.
Says that, I see what he's saying. He's right partially, but I also think, excuse me, he says, I also think that there's something important being communicated here about science. So, but not that, not what a literalist would say, right? And then there are the obviously the literalist, or the some people will say, like, fundamentalists, that say that no, how you read it off the page is in English is how it reads. And so I've always been just like exactly the answer you gave, is that, hey, look, I accept evolution and the old Earth and things like this, but I accept that I could be wrong about that, and I accept that if that is the case, I have no problem of just saying, like, oh, I must have just been confused, or ignorant on the topic.
Yeah. And I think what you said is correct. The Bible is clearly the inerrant word of God, inspired, who inspired humans to write it, to write the words down. When I say inerrant, I don't mean that it's literally word for word, as you said, in English, what is the scientific truth. But there's no reason why it should be. And the whole idea that it should be is a fairly new concept in Christianity. I mean, it started with George McReady Price in the 19th century. He was a Seventh-day Adventist, and then it got further promoted by the Genesis flood, which was written in 1960. I mean, these are new developments. So this is not traditional Christianity. It's an interesting idea. I certainly don't mock the people who believe that. I think that they are wonderful Christians, and to me, that's what counts. I mean, I'm someone who knows what it's like to not only not be a Christian, but to be a hater of Christianity. And so every time I find anyone anywhere, online or in person, who is a believing Christian, I say, thank God. And I don't care very much what their other views are.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so just to kind of wrap up this part with like a bow, basically. Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you. And I think that there are even probably some, you might just say, young Earth creationists, or people who deny, a lot of the common consensus of science, that are probably better Christians than some of the others who are intellectually fulfilled but aren't as good a believer, right?
It can happen. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. Is not that they are, but that there are some that are, right? But on both sides, there are some people that believe, completely that, hey, listen, this everything was created six literal days, and that they believe that wholeheartedly, but they're not even as good a believer as somebody who accepts the consensus of science on a lot of these issues. So
that can happen too. Yep.
Yeah. So that's why we just got to make sure that we're open to the possibilities. And so the next thing I want to move on to is we talked about the possibility of being wrong. You and I, we were working on another project before, and we were talking about kind of how United States Christians are kind of molded by, you might say, North American Christianity. And so there are differences that maybe didn't start with Christianity, but they're like these these views that kind of grow up. And one thing I want to talk about is in science. I want to talk about a little bit about the distinction between natural and supernatural. People that watch my show will be very familiar because I bring up this distinction a lot because I think it's so confused. And so I want to get your take on this, because I believe as Christians that we can be, and maybe should be, maybe I'm wrong, but maybe should be, methodological naturalist, but not metaphysical naturalist. And what I mean by that, of course, is that I believe that we should look at the natural world as if it's going to have a natural process in place. Everything that I'm looking at, I'm not looking under a rock to be like, is there supernatural here, right? When I'm discovering the natural world, I'm a methodological naturalist. That's the method I use. But I use this example to kind of clarify, and you can tell me what you think. Say I were to create a simulated universe with conscious beings, or like characters, like even a virtual reality, like a video game or something, right? I create a video game like Mario, and I put characters in there, and they're conscious, and they can do whatever. If I'm going to enter that, I do what Christ did. I assume flesh. I become a character in the game, right? I don't go into the virtual realm as a physical person, right? Because that is a difference in realm. And so what I'm saying with all that is supernatural, it seems to me, can only be really pointed to, let's say, through causation. And so if I'm playing cards and I get 4 aces and I get it 3 times in a row, well, that can happen naturally. So maybe you just go, well, that's happened naturally. But let's say that I got 4 aces 400 times in a row. The person is going to say, wait a second, this doesn't seem like a natural occurrence. This seems like the causation.
Excuse me.
Seems like the causation of this is probably an agent and not just a natural occurrence.
Right.
But like I say, I think that God, even interacting with the natural world, would do so in natural terms. So if Christ was going to walk on water or something, he would, in the video game, you would use what's called a mod chip, right? So that you mod the actual virtual world. You don't go in there as a physical being and like hold them up with your physical hands, right? So just give me kind of your thoughts about all this, because I'm not a specialist in this area or anything. I'm just thinking out loud about these things. So what do you think?
Well, I think that's interesting. The problem I have is I'm pretty old, so the video game world is a little outside of my depth. I've never done gaming, but my view on natural and supernatural is that those are definitions which keep changing. And what I mean by that is, and I agree with what you said about metaphysical naturalism being very different from methodological naturalism, which is the method of science. Metaphysical naturalism is a philosophy that says only what we call natural exists. There is no supernatural. Now, that could be true, but it's only true if we define what is natural in a way that's very fluid. And by that, let's take an example. Right now, today, in this day, if we saw a miracle, let's say, I don't know, think of a miracle, anything that would be miraculous, getting 400 aces in a row. Okay, you wouldn't believe that that was a natural thing because it seems so outrageous. But what if we were not today, but we were living, I don't know, when I was a kid, okay? And I said to somebody, I'm going to call my friend, let me get to the phone. And I pick up the phone and I start dialing the rotary dial to call my friend. And my sister said to me, why are you doing that? Why don't you just, here, use my phone and you can see him and you can talk to him and you can, take a picture and you can do a video call. And I'd say, what? What are you talking about? That's not possible. Now, this is a trivial example, right? It's technology. And we all know that technology, it's just the old idea was, well, in 200 years ago, if you went to the wall and touched it and the room became light, people would say a miracle. And now, of course, it's just lifeless. So that's trivial. But let's take a look at that in a little more depth. Let's take a look at, for example, the world of physics, which explains all of reality. If you were walking around in 1890 and you were talking to a physicist and you said to them, well, and they were saying, gee, it's really interesting what light does. And, it would be great if we could figure out how light moves in the ether. And you said, well, actually, there is no ether. And in fact, light is something very strange. It actually has a constant speed, and it's waves and particles at the same time. Okay, we often talk about Jesus being God and human, and physics knows that light is waves and particles, which are two different things, but it's both at the same time. Now, all of that would have been considered supernatural in 1890 if I had said that to a physicist. And the physicist would have said to me, no, I only care about what I can measure. I care about science. I care about nature. I don't care about this supernatural stuff about 2 points being, interconnected, even if they're separated by millions of light years. I don't care about all this, reality depends on who's looking at it. That's nonsense. Well, guess what? It's not nonsense. It's true. It's real. It's what we now know to be true. It's what we now call natural. Right. And that has been going on since the dawn of science. What we call natural, the goalpost keeps moving. And everything that we used to think was supernatural has become natural. Not everything, but a lot of things. So the question is, when will that stop? Have we now reached the point where we know exactly what's true through science and nature? It won't get any better in the future. Nobody believes that. So what are we going to learn in the future about what is natural and what is supernatural? We might find out, for example, that, purpose is an important part of reality, of natural reality. It's not just in our brains. Maybe it turns out that it's a fundamental property of biological matter, that it has purpose. And that's no longer supernatural. That becomes natural. Did I get lost again? I don't hear you. You're muted.
Oh, sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry, we lost you there for a second. Just at the end, though, you're saying that, hey, have we arrived? Have we arrived at exactly what? Yeah.
Yeah. So what I was saying, we can pretty much be sure. I mean, people talk about the Bible not having accurate science. Well, that's 5,000 years ago. Do we think that 5,000 years from now, people will think that we were accurate? They're going to laugh at us.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because that's exactly the conversation I had the other night when people were they were saying, yeah, but think about how dumb they were back then. And I said, okay, that was 2,000 years ago. What do you think about 2,000 years from now? They're gonna laugh and be like, oh, these people believe gravity accelerated at 9.8 meters per second squared. No, it's actually.
Oh, I guess I went out again. What's going on?
So yeah, that was a really good point, because that's kind of what it's like it moves in cycles almost. They're going to look back on us as if we're not intelligent, enough. And so that's a really great point to make. Can you still hear me?
Yes, I do, but I think I may have gotten out again. So I'm going to see if I can connect a different way. My internet might be a little unstable.
Did we lose you, Si?
Oh, looks like you did. Hold on.
Oh, sorry. I can hear you now. Yeah, you're good now.
My internet is a little unstable. I'm going to see if I can.
You're fine now.
I'm okay now. Okay.
Yep.
Good.
So I think we pretty much are in agreement there. When you're studying the natural world, it makes sense to be a methodological naturalist because that's what you're doing. But something that happens, like this is where this originally started for me years ago, is somebody came up to me and they said, show me the supernatural and I'll believe. Just show it to me. And I thought about it and something just clicked and it went. And I immediately said, like, so you want me to show you the supernatural in natural terms?
Right.
And they thought about it, and then you could see that it clicked with them. They were like, oh yeah, that's not a good question. It's a category error.
Right.
So it's kind of like with ghosts and stuff. It's like, yeah, if you can see a ghost, is that supernatural? Because it just seems like it's empirical at that point, even though it's an unordinary, it's not an ordinary occurrence, right? But that's why I'm saying that there may just be a different in realm from the supernatural to the natural, so that we would only be able to look at causation, something like Christ walk on water, right? And it's like, well, people can't do that. So it's like there had to have been some other explanation for this if all the natural ones were ruled out, let's say, right? So I mean, I think we're pretty much on the same page there. I agree with your point, though, that it depends on how you define your terms.
Exactly.
Because if you don't define naturalism or nature as just what we can observe empirically or the natural world or something like that, but you allow for things outside of the natural world to also be included in natural things, then it's like, well, yeah, something that we might typically call supernatural could be natural. So it's 100% correct. It depends on how you define it, first of all.
Exactly. Right.
And then you move on. It's the same way in science, right? That you start with your terms and your framework, your model, and then you see if it works and you see what you get from it.
Right.
So what is the question that you get a lot that you think is most misunderstood? Maybe you answered something like this in your book, but like, what do you think about science and Christianity is most misunderstood? Because we hear all kind of like tropes all the time about like, oh, well, do you believe in religion or science and things like this, right? What do you think are kind of the most misunderstood points that people make?
Well, I think I'll tell you in a second, but first you mentioned my book again, and the reason I wrote the book, I mean, I had a very clear purpose for it and a clear audience. And the purpose was to debunk this myth of incompatibility between science and faith, and Christian faith. It's just not true, and there's so many arguments to show why it's not true. And in fact, that they go very well together. But the argument that I find most very common and totally wrong is, and I even tweeted about this a few days ago, the argument is, well, science has always provided the right explanation to explain natural events, natural phenomena, and religion has never done so. And what I call that a straw man, because I don't know, since the Middle Ages or maybe even earlier, I don't know any religious person who has ever claimed that the purpose of their religion is to explain natural events. It's very likely that people used to think that thunder was the result of, Thor throwing thunderbolts, but that's a long time ago. And since the dawn of science, which was in fact a product of Christian thought in Western Europe, I mean, all the European scientists were Christians, and they were all looking to explain God's natural world and his creation. And they never saw a conflict. In fact, that's why they were doing the work. They wanted to study God's creation and how it worked. And so, yeah, of course, science always comes up with the best explanation. That's its job. It's not the job of religion to do that. And it hasn't been for a very long time. I mean, when it was the job of religion, it's because that's all there was. That was the only thing people had to think about. But now it's not an argument. It's just completely silly. There's another view that I occasionally hear that was first also articulated by Richard Dawkins in a very famous quote. And what he says is that the universe is exactly the way, I'm paraphrasing because I don't have it by heart, the universe is exactly the way we would expect it to be if there were no purpose, no good, no evil, nothing but pitiless indifference at bottom in the universe. And I think that statement is a claim, which, as the atheists love to say, claims are not evidence. There is, and in fact, there is, I believe, no evidence for that claim at all. I would suggest that science has provided some evidence that the exact opposite is the case. We find the universe to be fine-tuned beyond any reason. We find things in life that do not suggest a pitiless indifference at all. And so that's the view that I am now working to fight against, the idea that the universe is pitiless. I think the universe shows all signs of being a creation by God, full of love.
Yeah, and that totally makes sense to me. I know that quote is used a lot, and I think that is because Richard Dawkins was kind of being open and kind of honest with his thoughts right there, and I think that while a lot of atheists and non-theists will agree with him on, that, and they're not going to be as open about it. But I think there's obviously some that are going to disagree with what he says. But I think that's actually a pretty honest thing to say, in that really I think a lot of theists have kind of made that argument as well, that like, hey, listen, if there's no God at bottom, what do we have? We have a random universe that just happened to, make a right area for life to flourish and so forth. And we've evolved from that to conscious creatures that can like reflect on the world, but it's like, what does that get you? I see a big difference when I read the philosophers of old in atheism, like the existentialists, like Nietzsche, Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, and some of these other thinkers, and their thinking about theism and atheism was so different from what I contend with today. Albert Camus, when he thought about it, he didn't go like, yeah, so we should start our own groups and like have our own atheist hangouts and stuff. And then he said something like, the only question modern man has to answer is why not end your life? And I'm like, because he thinks that it entails that. Now, I can understand an atheist saying like, hey, look, that's, I disagree with him. I don't think that's correct. But I'm just saying there has been a significant change from that type of thought in the atheist community to what we get today, where there are atheist churches and things, right?
Yeah, right.
And so, I can definitely appreciate what you're saying about some of the myths associated with science and religion, and I appreciate you taking the time to combat some of that. I think you would also agree with me, though, that atheists have provided kind of a service as well, in the sense that when questioning things about theism, they bring up points that maybe a pious theist wouldn't have thought about because they're too afraid to question things, right? And thus we get, entire fields of theology, like, involving modalism and all these different, things that are surrounded by the problem of evil and problem of foreknowledge, and all of these things that you could say partially are helped along, or given to us in part by some of these non-theist questions. And so I think you could probably agree with that they also have contributed in some way to theism.
I think I do. I think I agree with that. Yes. I think theists, let me just say, I think Christians, because I think it would be different for every form of religion. Christians should have doubts, can have doubts. Doubt is part of faith. And I've had doubts occasionally.
Yeah, I guess I mean more with bringing about some things that we might be worried about thinking about, because it's like the pious, some of the pious Catholics, for example, they didn't want Kepler and Galileo and these guys working on some things they haven't thought about, because they're like, well, what does this mean for our beliefs? But if you're really like, if you are strong in your beliefs, you're not going to worry, because this is a point that I've always made that I think you would agree with, is like, if we find it in the natural world, that's the way God made it. Right. Now we might find something that's a little different, and we might use a theological excuse, like, for example, or explanation like that, we find cancer or some other thing in the world. We might say, hey, we're in a fallen world now, right? So it's not the exact way God made it. But if we find something, for example, that we can observe and it's true, and still the way God made it, we shouldn't be afraid of those types of things, right?
No, we should. I agree. We should never be afraid of seeking the truth, because the truth, all truth is God's truth. So we're not going to find any truth that should affect our faith and our belief, and certainly not in science. I mean, I guess I have a weird situation in that I became a Christian almost before I began to believe in God. It was the figure of Jesus Christ that brought me to faith. God was just a concept I couldn't get my head around. But Jesus Christ was a person, and he, the fact that God, became a man and came to earth and talked to us and taught us, and then died for us, and then rose. These are all facts as far as I'm concerned. I don't think you need faith to believe these. The facts, I've been convinced by the apologists, the very famous people, I don't have to mention them, who have found the facts to support that. But even if there's some doubt about those facts, I still know that it's true, because of my personal experience with Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit. So I know that it's true. And once you know that that's true, all the other theological issues, and it may sound cavalier for me to say this, but the big problem of evil, the problem of omnipotence, all these theological problems, they're real problems. I don't know if we'll solve them. I don't know if we'll get the answers. Just like I know there are parts of science that seem incredibly difficult to get to the bottom of. Dark energy, the origin of life. I mean, these are hard problems. But there are solutions, and those solutions are known by God. And if we have faith that God will give us at some point, we'll find out the answer to theodicy. We'll find out why there's evil. We'll find out how life began and what dark matter is all about. We're gonna find that out. That's what I'm looking forward to in the new world. And when we find that out, we'll say, "Oh, praise the Lord. Thank you."
That's amazing. Yeah, see, you guys were talking to Dr. Cy Garte, and we're going to go to Q&A here in just a few minutes. But what you just were touching on, I agree with you. And I had, one day I was talking to Dr. Josh, another guy that we talk with on, he kind of does discussions and debates here online with us. And
Josh,
Dr. Josh Bowen.
Bowen. Oh, Josh Bowen. Yeah, I know. Yeah.
And one day we were in a live
Digital Hammurabi.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We were in a live stream talking one day, and he said something like, somebody was bringing up, the historical reliability of some text or something, or It may have been that did Mark, use Matthew, or did Matthew have an original and Mark used it, or and Luke has content that Mark doesn't have, or Matthew or John. John has original content. And we were going through some of these things, right, and talking about the work of Ehrman and others. And Josh, when he came in, he was real honest with me and the other people. He said, you know what? It's really not about that stuff to me, because I can see, if God exists, it's obvious that he can preserve his word, and, things like this. He was just being genuine, and he was just saying, like, a lot of my family is believers, and I used to be a believer. And you know what? Honestly, I would be fine with believing, and it's just more to me that I don't have the experience or something like that, to believe. It wouldn't be some argument that, like, yeah, well, the fine-tuning argument doesn't work enough to prove God or whatever, or how do we know this is reliable scripture or something like that? He's like, and I think that's kind of what you're pointing out as well, that, like, no matter what science is going to tell us, you don't look at a fossil or at, some formula or a test tube or something, a beaker, and just go, therefore God doesn't exist. Right? And so, is there anything you want to add to that before we?
I'll just tell you a little anecdote about Josh and I were on I think it was Modern Day Debate. It was one of the debate shows, and we were on opposite sides, and it was 2 against 2. And what ended up at the end was that he and I agreed on everything in the middle between the other 2 people. So. Yeah, I have a lot of respect for him. He's a real scholar. He really knows his stuff. Mm-hmm. And frankly, I haven't met too many scholars, either in science or in Christian biblical scholarship, who say dumb things. I mean, that's the point about being a scholar. You immediately get a sense of humility, and you realize, wow, there's an awful lot of stuff I don't know. So I'm not going to say stuff that I think is true if I don't know it's true.
That's exactly right. And so the last thing, I guess, before we get to the Q&A is, we were working on a project before we came in here, and we're working on some content for, a video, and I thought, you know what, let's go ahead and do it before we go on air, and that's going to, get it out of the way. But, I was thinking when we were having this conversation, I'm like, man, this is actually deep right here. This is where it's at. Like, this is actually an important thing to bring out. So maybe we'll talk a little bit about that before we go into the Q&A. So I want to have on Dr. Garte originally, because I'm working on some content about, there are some different, and I'm not talking about just one group. There are different sects, religions, and different groups that look at characters from history, and a single character they want to say is the progenitor of an entire race of people. So, for example, the one that we talked about is that I thought about doing this because right now it's all over the news that Asian people are getting a lot of hate right now. Right? They're just some people say it's because coronavirus, and they're being called like China virus and things like this, but there are other reasons as well, I think. And so there are groups that have been preaching for years and writing about this and making videos that because of Asian features, they are the product of this relationship that was produced in the Bible between Lot and his daughters, which obviously that type of relationship is condemned in the Bible as well. But they want to say that one person was the progenitor of an entire race of people. And Dr. Garte had a really good take on this, and I just wanted to, I didn't realize that you kind of specialized in this area. You want to just tell us a little bit about your answer and about how race is kind of constructed around our view here in North America, but not traditionally necessarily. So
I maybe only a few minutes. I do have a background in population genetics. It came from the work I was doing in other areas, but I eventually branched off a little bit and published several papers on population genetics. especially related to the issue of race. And actually, this is the first time I met Francis Collins. We were at a symposium together about the question of race and genetics. And the reality is that, as I said before, is that genetics and race are only slightly connected. You can't determine someone's race by their genes. And the reality is that race is not a scientific construct, but it really is a social construct, and it differs in different cultures. So the American culture defines race very differently than other cultures. We tend to. Am I still on, or is there a problem? I don't know. Are you hearing me, William? Hello? Do you hear me?
I'm sorry. Can you hear me? We lost you there for a second, I believe.
Okay, now I'm back.
Right
I know, I could
sorry.
tell, and I connected with another server. Okay, sorry about that. I don't know what the last thing was heard. No, that's my
you're
fault.
saying that race. Yeah, go ahead.
That race is a cultural construct, and the American culture treats race very differently than other cultures. So we tend to look at somebody and judge their race based on their skin color. And without knowing it, we all use a very old rule from the South, which is called the one drop rule, which suggests that anybody who has any Negro ancestry is a Negro and therefore subject to slavery. This was a rule passed in the 1840s in the South. And so therefore we think that people who may have, maybe slightly dark we call them black. And that's not done in other countries of the world. And in terms of so race is a cultural construct. It's not genetic. The specific issue that you brought up about Asians is complete nonsense, because first of all, the eye shape, which is what they were talking about, that's we think of characteristic of Asians, is actually not characteristic of Asians. It's present in diverse degrees everywhere in the world, in Africa, in Europe, in Asia. There are many Chinese who don't have the epicanthic fold. There are many Europeans who do. There are many Africans who do. So it's the concept that this was a race that came directly from a single union of two people and then spread is just complete nonsense. And that's also not how races or populations form. Populations form in very different ways. So it's something that I've published about and talked about in the past, but it's an important issue, especially these days.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. I thought we'd just mention that because, like I said, it's kind of an important topic right now as far as, we're hearing in the news and whatnot. So, and I thought whenever I was originally I was like, maybe we'll just save that for off stream. But then I was like, well, this is kind of important for right now, So anyway, thanks so much for that. So we're going to get to the Q&A now. We've almost exhausted Sai, I'm sure, but let's let me ask a couple questions here. We have a question from Eric Vierenthaler, 92. He says, what does Sai think about Behemoth and Leviathan in Job? Do you have an opinion on that or anything to say about it?
What do I think about them? They're very big. I don't know what you mean. What do I think they are? I'm not sure what the question is.
Yeah, I'm not sure. If you want to clarify that, we'll come back to your question.
I don't understand.
Yeah. If you want to clarify in the chat, I might be able to get to it. Our next question we had comes from, the same person said that they lost a lot of friends over being over not being a young Earth creationist anymore, and being a theistic evolutionist. And they
Yay.
had a problem with him reading Hugh Ross's book. He got accused of not believing in the resurrection. Do you want to add anything to that?
I love Hugh Ross's work. I mean, I don't agree with everything he says, but wow, we actually know each other. We've met at conferences and things, and he's a wonderful guy. His work is brilliant. And whenever he's finished talking and I'm listening to him, I agree with everything he said. Later, I might think, well, maybe he left out a few things, but no, I think Hugh Ross is right on. And he is, well, what was the question? Was about not believing in the resurrection? That's not about Hugh Ross.
Yeah, that seemed like, well, he just said that because he was reading Hugh Ross's book, they just kind of like, said, you know what, if you're even reading,
I think I get it.
Yeah,
I think I get it. So there are some young Earth creationists. This is the only thing that really bothers me about young Earth creationists, and it's only a few of them, I hope. They will say, if you don't believe in the literal Bible, every word that is written in the Bible is absolutely 100% literally true. In the English translation of the Greek translation of the Hebrew, whatever. If you don't believe all of that, then you can't believe that Christ rose from the dead. And that's just absolute nonsense. And that gets me actually more upset than almost anything an atheist would say. I mean, it's so completely untrue. And let's remember again, please, that young Earth creationism is a brand new idea. It is not a traditional Christian idea. It began in the 1890s. It got a big boost in 1960 with the Genesis flood. It's brand new. It's not traditionally Christian. And theistic evolution is even newer, but it is certainly not. I don't know a single theistic evolutionist, and I know many, who doesn't believe in the resurrection. Okay, let's put that to rest. The resurrection, if you don't believe in the resurrection, you're basically not a Christian. It's one of the definitions of Christianity. And so I don't know what else to say about that.
Yeah, sure. So their next question is a science question. It says, from Iron Charioteer, says, question for Dr. Garte. Some scientists say biological life has somewhat overcome entropy. What do they mean by that?
I don't know who says that, because it's clearly not true. A lot of people don't understand what entropy is. Entropy is not the idea that everything gets more chaotic. Entropy is a very specific thermodynamic property. And if you look carefully at a biochemical reaction, such as, you take anything, an enzymatic reaction that converts two simple things into one complex thing, you will also find that the entropy of that reaction has increased. Okay? This is what people don't know unless they've actually studied the details of the science, and I don't mean online. I mean, really study it, because entropy of a reaction is not just the reaction products and the reactants. It also includes the solvent. And what you often have is a transfer of entropy from the chemicals that are interacting to the water, and the entropy of the water goes up. So by definition, local entropies often increase. Sometimes they decrease, but what the second law of thermodynamics says is that the entropy of the entire system will increase, and the entire system is the universe. So you can't, there's nothing in life that is anti-entropic. And even if it were, it doesn't violate the second law, because the second law talks about energy being, sufficient energy will allow things to go against the direction of entropy. And we have a huge amount of energy available on this planet from the sun. So there is no problem with occasional reactions going against entropy, but most of them do not. So some people say that, biology is anti-entropic, but they are not scientists. Okay. If you have a citation of a scientist who has said that, I'd love to see it. Yeah,
sure. Our next question, it looks like, comes from the same person, and they say, sorry if this comes off a little insensitive. I didn't mean that any disrespect by it, but Their question is, ask Dr. Garte, do you think that religions inherently stifle free thinking, questions, and doubt because of Scripture?
Well, I've certainly heard people tell me that, and I find myself very fortunate that I've never been in a situation in any church I've ever been to where I felt that, but I've heard other people testify to that. They say that they were in a Baptist church in the South, for example, where, if they said anything that didn't go against dogma, they'd be ostracized. So I know it happens. But it also happens outside of religion. I mean, I certainly know all about dogma and being ostracized if you go against it from growing up in a family of communists. I don't know if you were here for the beginning, but my background was that whatever Comrade Stalin said is true, and you don't dispute it. So it's not limited to religion. You find it everywhere. You find it in modern politics today. I won't mention any names, but there are certain political figures who you have to take everything they say as gospel. Otherwise, you're considered, a pariah. So, yeah, it's a human trait to do that. And it's not limited to religion, and it's not universal in religion. In my case, as I said, I've been fortunate at my own church and every church I've been to, and that includes a non-affiliated Baptist, Presbyterian, Catholic, how many church, Methodist. I am a Methodist. All of those churches I've been to, I've never experienced that. So I'm lucky.
Yeah, sure.
But I think that's the way the world is. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. And thanks so much for that. Our next question is from Theoretically. He says, where does Dr. Garte stand on the separation between church and state, secular laws, and education? Any opinion on
100% in favor of the separation of church and state. The American Constitution, secular education, I think, belongs in the public schools. I also, the only place I would differ is that I think prayer is not an abomination, and I think prayer should be in schools, but that's my own personal view. And, I don't push it very strongly, but otherwise I'm definitely for separation of church and state. Yeah, that's sure. That's an American value. I don't know who's against that.
Yeah. Well, even Christ said that, render to Caesar what's Caesar's and God what's God.
Right. There you go.
Yeah. So that seemed all right. So we got a question here from Titan. Says, question on the race issue: there are no races, only one species, Homo sapiens, congruent with his previous statement?
Absolutely. It's exactly what I was trying to say. There is only one race, the human race. And by the way, the first person who ever say this in history, as far as I know, and I would love to hear from somebody like Josh Bowen or any of the other historians who want to weigh in. But the first person to say that all are one was Paul, a Christian who was talking, the famous line, there is no male nor female, slave nor free, Jew or Greek, on and on, mentioned several other ethnicities, all are one in Jesus Christ. And that was a statement that was incredibly revolutionary for the time. Nobody would ever have thought of that. No difference between slave or free, male or female. What, are they crazy? And that is what we now believe, and that is the truth. And science backs it up once again completely because of what I briefly said. But this is a very large topic, which I didn't couldn't go into.
Yeah, and we also see in Acts chapter 17 where it says that God made all mankind from one blood, right?
Yeah.
And so
something like that.
Yeah. Stephen Steen says, question for Cy: what in CC's DNA makes him such a good-looking guy and not me?
Do you know Stephen?
Yeah.
Do you know Stephen Steen? Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a standard question from Stephen, who I love dearly, by the way, Steve. Don't worry.
As James would say, the nasty guy.
James loves him too. We all love him. So, I'm actually, Stephen, I'm actually doing research on that. I'm trying to find out now where in the DNA it is that you ended up so ugly. Okay. And when I find out, I'll let you know.
He's doing trials right now. So, yeah, I can't moderate a debate on modern day debate without getting something like that from Steam. So, let's see.
We all love Steve.
Got another political question here. Congress has just passed a hate crime bill in response to the recent wave of attacks on nations. Okay, so that was more of a statement than a question. I thought maybe that was a question. Let's see. Any more questions before we go? So we have, did you want to say anything?
I saw one from Brenda. What is the substance of the supernatural?
Okay, I thought that was for, okay, maybe I didn't know if that was for you or me. Let's see.
Oh, I don't know. Maybe it wasn't for me.
Okay. Would you, I see it here. Do you want to respond to this?
Well, I think it's a good question, and it goes along with what we were talking about, defining the natural and the supernatural. But it also raises the question of what is the substance of the natural, and we don't know that yet. I mean, what would you call the substance of the natural? Matter and energy, but what is matter? Matter and energy are the same, and what is the substance of the natural? Is it physical reality? Well, that's tricky, because if I put my hand on my desk, it feels solid, but I know from physics that it's not solid at all. It's mostly empty space. The only reason my hand can't go through my desk is because of electrostatic interactions, which existed 100 years ago. So the substance of the natural is a tricky question, and the substance of the supernatural is probably just as tricky. And I don't think we have the answers to either one yet. Okay, so I'm reading Brenda's comment. Do you see that? Am I gone again?
I'm sorry. I was on mute. Yeah. So Brenda is saying that.
Oh, okay.
That, yeah, Brenda really likes you and wants more Christians to be like you, and so.
Yeah, we go way back. I've seen her before.
We had a question from Jesse King. Says, Converse and Psi, is a literal Adam and the fall of man necessary for there to be a reason for Jesus to save? If evolution and long time are true, what would his view be on the origin of sin?
Okay, so literal Adam is a whole huge area which I don't like to talk about, because I honestly don't know the answer. And I, again, don't think it matters, because what really counts, as you say in the question, is the fall of man. And there's no question that we are fallen creatures. Nobody can testify more to how sinful we are than I. I mean, I could have defined myself as a man of sin, and probably I know I still am, maybe not as much as I used to be, but so there's no question that we are sinful creatures and we are fallen and we need to be saved. And Jesus is our Savior. That sounds very simplistic, but to me, that's the basis. I try to avoid sin as much as I can. I know I'm still not able to do it completely. The origin of sin is our human nature. And you could say that was Adam. You could say that Adam is a symbol for the kinds of things that we do. I mean, what did Adam do? He disobeyed God. He did not respect the one entity, God, that he should have respected, and he disobeyed. And who doesn't do that? I mean, we all do that. We do that from childhood on. And so, the origin of sin is the origin of humanity. And whether you call the origin of humanity Adam, or you want to take an evolutionary view, the result is the same. We are in need of salvation, and we get it from Jesus Christ.
Yeah, that's a great point. In fact, I just happen to have here on my desk Dr. Swamidas' book, The Genealogical Adam and Eve. And to kind of build on what Cy was saying. That,
Yeah, I talked to Josh 2 days ago.
Did you? Okay.
Yeah.
I moderated a
Yeah.
debate on modern day debate between
Josh
and Lynx. Go ahead.
Oh,
Sorry,
Nathan Lent, right.
Yeah.
Josh and I go way back. We're pretty good friends. I wrote a review of his book in Proceedings in Science and Christian Faith, and I, I'm not sure I completely on board with everything he says in the book, but I think it's a very interesting take. And as you know, Josh is both a evolutionary creationist. He definitely holds to evolution, as he says very clearly. But he has an interesting theological idea which is scientifically valid for the possibility of a literal atom. Now, whether that is theologically acceptable to everyone, I don't know. I mean, I find it interesting. And it's just one of the many, how do I put it? It's one of the many possibilities for the origin of humanity. One thing I will say clearly, if I may, I do not believe that human beings are only a result of evolutionary forces. Okay. They are a result of evolutionary forces, but there's more to it than that, because I don't think that evolution can completely explain just what we're doing here. Okay. There's something else that happened in the origin of humanity. That's my belief. I don't have any scientific evidence for it, except for the fact that here we are talking. I'm looking at a screen and I'm talking to people who are hearing me, who, it's crazy. I mean, how could we ever imagine that the reality of humans could be the way it is? It's amazing. It's remarkable. And so I think that evolution is part of it and God is the rest.
For sure. Yeah, and I don't think most people would disagree with you, most Christians. I would say that the reason why I brought up the book is because, number one, is sitting here, I'm reading through it. When I get through it, I've got part of the way through it, but I'm working on other stuff as well. And I want to have him on and talk about his view. But I have actually seen a discussion he had with William Lane Craig where they disagreed on the position. On both their positions are different. Yeah, and then I've seen other positions that also disagree, right? So that I just wanted to point out that these things are being debated, and there are multiple ways to look at this, and that we don't want to, obviously limit it, but we just want to be able to be open to some of these possibilities. So, with that being said, is there anything you want to add before we go? I feel like there's something I'm forgetting, but yeah.
Well, I might just mention my book, because that's sort of my job. I always have to mention my book.
Yeah, definitely. I got it linked in the description, actually, already.
Oh, great. Okay. So that's good. I didn't realize. So a lot of what I talked about, especially earlier, about my own journey to faith, that's the subtitle. It's what happened? Am I back?
Yeah, I can hear you.
I guess my internet is telling me it's time to get off.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, but I have already linked your book in the description, and we're gonna make sure that I'll go ahead and link it as well in the chat at this point. I'm sorry, in this video at this point, I'll go ahead and put a little pop up on the top with the link to the book. That way, people watching it later, they can just click that link as soon as it pops up. But yeah, thanks so much for being here with us and helping me out with some of the other things we're working on. And yeah, I really appreciate it. And everybody else that's been with us in the chat and everything, thanks so much for watching this. Please hit the like button on your way out. If you're new to the channel, please hit subscribe. I'm going to have a lot more interviews coming up in a couple of weeks. I got Dr. Kurt McGregor. I got Michael Heiser in June. And then I have one more I'm working on as well. So we got a lot of interesting discussions coming on. And yeah, just thanks so much for being here with us, Dr. Garte.
It was great fun. Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.